Alright, so our question for today is how do you design enemy movement in a video game? Hello, I'm Carl Maxwell, and I'd like to talk to you for a while about enemy movement and video game design. So, when you're talking about game design, it's important to think about what kind of game you're talking about, because game design varies considerably depending on what kind of game you're looking at. So, when I think about game design, my goal is to think about how to understand first person shooters. So, specifically here, I look at single player, action oriented games. Maybe something like Spelunky or Mega Man X or Doom would be kind of examples of roughly the direction that I look at. Whether it's platforming or like dodging enemy projectiles or stuff like this. It's sort of like um, I just really enjoy these kinds of games where you're moving around a lot and there's a lot of motion and interaction going on between different sorts of characters. And so when I talk about enemy movement, that's kind of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the player character here. He has some verbs, some ability to move around in different ways. And so, you might think of something like in a side-scrolling platformer, right? You might have the ability to like move left and right, to jump. You can probably wall slide down a wall slide down walls. You might be able to double jump, dash, dodge, or do like a teleporting lunge kind of thing. These kinds of things. And so when you're designing enemy movement patterns, you're really thinking about, the player character starts somewhere in a level and they're trying to get somewhere, right? And they're going to use their verbs, their movement abilities, like the way that they can move around the level. They're going to use that capacity to move from that starting point to the end point. And while they're moving along, they're going to go through any objectives that they need to go through in the process of doing that. And so then when you're thinking about enemy movement patterns, you're going to want to add enemies and add enemy movement patterns that relate to that player movement, the way that they're going to move through the level. And you're going to want to design those patterns so that they not only they relate to the player, but they interact with the player's movement patterns that you've established in that level. And so this is the kind of stuff that I want to talk about today. And I just want to get this established up front, like the kind of the genre that we're talking about and sort of the space that we're describing. I think maybe what we should be asking ourselves is why do enemies move at all? Let's start by looking at Doom 1993. This is the level called E1M4. On lower difficulty levels, this first room of the level is empty. As you increase the difficulty level, the game will add 3 ordinary enemies in this room. And when you go up to the highest difficulty levels, it'll also add 2 imps. Now, I've got a question for you. If the player just walks into this room and they simply stand there and allow these enemies to attack them, how long do you think it would take before the player died? Keep in mind here that this is a fast-paced video game, so when we're talking about how long something takes, we're usually going to be measuring that in thousandths of a second, right? In milliseconds. So I'm going to suggest that you take some time to consider this question. I would actually recommend that you pause the video here and come back tomorrow, or maybe just take 20 minutes to think about it and then come back. I'll give you a little chance here to pause, and then we'll come back and we'll continue talking about this. So the answer to the question is that it takes about 10 seconds for the player to die in that particular situation. The specific amount of time varies wildly based off of randomness and where you choose to stand and what happens and whether the enemies end up fighting each other. But I've done it a bunch of times, and basically it's about 10 seconds. And if you were expecting something like 1 second or a few milliseconds, then that would be very surprising. This is orders of magnitude longer than you would expect, right? I think your expectation would probably be that it would take 1 or 2 seconds. That's probably where I would have guessed. And a lot of people seem to think that it would be a few milliseconds, right? A few frames. A lot of newer designers will have the games set up in a way where the player dies in like 1 hit or 2 hits, or they die really fast when they get hit by enemies. And that's not actually how these kinds of games are designed. If you look at classic, well-designed action games, they're like the opposite of that, actually, right? Most of them they let you take a lot of hits before you go down. Even on this is only the 4th level of the game, so it's not a very advanced level, but it's not the first level of the game, right? Like this is kind of, post-tutorial, like you're kind of in the game at this point. So now the question becomes, why? Why do classic, fast-paced action games give you so much time when you would expect that they would give you very little time, right? These games are trying to be very fast and very fluid, so your intuition and like a normal person's intuition going into this before you learn otherwise is going to be that you would expect to have very little time. You'd expect this to be really fast, right? And it's important to realize here that this is a tiny part of this level, right? Doom levels are famously very large. This level has 85 enemies on it, right? So the first 5 enemies that you're encountering, there's still 80 more enemies in the level that you have to go deal with. So it's not a big encounter. It's a small encounter in a very large level. So when the game gives you this long duration of time to deal with this, you have to really realize that it's a strange thing to do, right? It's a counterintuitive design choice, because in this fast-paced game, they're letting you go slowly. They're letting you deal with the threat of this initial encounter in your own time. It's letting you explore this encounter and wander around in it and play around, try different things. And because you've got so much time, you can actually do this encounter. You can get through this encounter in a lot of different ways. And you can do all kinds of things that are like suboptimal tactically. You can attack the enemies in the wrong order. You can wander around. You can, run around them in a circle, all kinds of stuff, right? And I think when you think about why they would do this, why they would give you this extra time, I think that's the reason, right? They want you to be able to be kind of playful with how you experiment with the gameplay, right? They don't want to give you just a really harsh situation where you have to do one specific thing and you can't try anything else, and if you don't do exactly the right thing, then you die. No, they want the exact opposite of that, right? They want you playing around, trying weird things and experimenting and just like kind of like living in this game, in this play space. I think that's the point of this, and I think this is a really important principle to think about. So we've got our first principle. We have to give the player time. I call this principle headspace. Headspace is just my own made-up term for this because I need a term for it and I don't know what anyone else calls it, so I just call it headspace. All right, let's pull up Dishonored now and see how that game treats headspace. And you're going to see it's very different from from what we were seeing in Doom 1993. Dishonored 2012, it's a stealth game, so it's structured very differently. So as you can see, in Dishonored, you die a lot faster than you do in Doom, right? Here I died in 2 hits, and the precise number varies, but, you know, we're talking 10 times faster than in Doom, right? So whereas in Doom we had 10 seconds, now we're looking at maybe 1 second, right? So huge difference, right? Again, like this is just, if we were expecting that what we saw in Doom was going to hold in other games, then immediately we're surprised, right? This is completely different. So here we get into kind of a subtle point. The thing about Headspace is that it's not a rule of thumb, right? It's not, Headspace isn't saying, okay, well, whenever you fight an enemy, they need to give you 10 seconds before they kill you, right? That's not what it says. Instead, what it is it's saying that the player needs to be able to see their situation and they need to be able to think about it, right? And that can be achieved in any number of ways, right? Like you can just, there's an unimaginable variety of ways that you could achieve that kind of result. The way that I like to think about this is I think of it as like a mental effort budget, right? Because it's not just about time. When we were looking at the Doom example, we were mainly looking at how many seconds the player got, but the amount of time isn't really, it's not the only factor, right? Like you could imagine a situation where they have a lot more time, but they feel a lot less comfortable, right? And so they might not, if they're too like nervous or they're too like freaked out by their situation, they might not be able to make like effective plans and be able to observe things. They might feel like they have to rush ahead. And so Headspace, it's more nuanced than just, giving the player time to think. It's not quite like that. It's a little bit more subtle. I'll get into it more in later videos, but this is the general idea. There's sort of different ways to do it. You give the player time to plan. So the way that Dishonored creates headspace for the player, the way that it allows them to see their situation and think about it, is that it is structured in a typical stealth game fashion, where you have these periods of time between combats where you can explore without much risk of the enemies attacking you, right? That there's a certain risk of if they see you, you have to run away. There's certain things like that. But in general, you get this kind of free time to look at the enemies and see what they're doing, watch their patrol patterns, and decide how you want to approach these situations ahead of time. And this is completely different than Doom. Doom thrusts you like right into like a coliseum, a gladiatorial arena, and then it says, okay, well, you need to be able to think about this situation, so we'll have things go kind of slowly once you're in there, and that'll give you the opportunity to think about things. But they put you right in the middle of the combat immediately, and then they just let you kind of wander around a bit while you're fighting. Whereas Dishonored does the opposite. It makes the combat extremely deadly and extremely short, and then it makes long periods of space between the combats so that you can look at things and see what's coming up and decide if you want to go around certain combats and stuff like this. All right, so we've got our first principle, headspace. So now let's just take that and try to apply it to some kind of design. We'll just open a simple drawing app here and we'll just try to draw a side-scrolling platformer. And we'll just try to see, what kind of thing we're going to design. So let's look at Headspace. Headspace says we need to give the player time, right? So what happens if we take that to the extreme? What happens if the enemy just gives us infinite time and we can just wait forever? So how are we going to do this? So I just figured out that N++ actually has its own in-game level editor. So I just, just made this as a N++ level. So we can see here that it works. The enemy stops us if we are careless. We can jump over him to get to the end of the level. And, we have to be careful about how close we get to him, because if we get too close, then we die. But we can get like pretty close. Not quite that close. Right, so it's only like it's only when we're like really close like this that we're really in any danger, right? Like if I'm back here, I don't care that enemy, like I don't care that guy's there at all, right? Like I could just do whatever I want. Similarly, like if I'm way over here, he's not having any effect on the map really. But if I'm like over here, then suddenly I'm going to be very careful about how I move around. You know, I don't want to be slightly off and collide with him. See, I didn't mean to hit him that time. It's very possible to make mistakes in these kinds of situations. So he creates this. So if we think about this, like he creates this like zone of danger, right? Like there's this area right around him in his immediate vicinity where we have to think about him, where we have to worry about him. But then most of the map, we don't care at all that he's here, right? So it's an interesting influence that he has on the map, especially in N++, because you can jump so high in this game that you can basically just totally go around the area that he influences. But yeah, you can see how, this area immediately around him, it's like, it's really only within one space of him that there's a concern, right? And that's actually really interesting because that is analogous to another idea. So in Dungeons & Dragons, there is an idea called threatened spaces, which basically says that a character threatens all spaces adjacent to them, and if anyone moves in those spaces, then you get a free attack on them. So we've got our next principle. The name of it comes from this D&D idea of threatening the player. But what does this idea mean in practice? So you can see how without that enemy there, the player just has this straight line to the end of the level. They just go straight through the level and then they win the game, and that's the whole thing, right? Whereas when the enemy is there, suddenly there's this gap. They're still basically doing the same thing, but then somewhere around the middle, they have to kind of jump and get over this enemy. So you're creating this little deflection here in the player's path through the level. And I think this is referred to as the critical path, the player's critical path through the level. And this is an interesting effect of enemies because even this enemy who's just standing there, he's not really doing anything. He's not taking any actions, right? He doesn't have any movement at all himself, and yet he's still affecting the movement of the game simply by existing because he affects the player's movement, right? He's creating this deflection in the player's movement. And so this is like one way in which enemies interact with the player. All right, well, I think we've got about as much as we're going to get out of the N++ level editor. Let's go ahead and we're going to need to set up like some kind of game prototype. So we're going to pull up Unreal Engine and start getting that going. All right, to get us started here, I'm going to create an enemy who wanders around randomly. Okay, well, looks like this is kind of working. There we go. Let me just get this level rearranged a little bit so that he doesn't go wandering off so far. You can already see here how this enemy who just wanders around randomly, he's not really doing that much for the game design, right? He's just there and he's just kind of moving around. He's just wandering. He's not really doing a specific thing, and it's kind of something. It's kind of like, as the designer, it's sort of like you're asking, like, hey, please, enemies, will you participate in the game with the player? Will you play with the player instead of just doing your own thing? And sometimes they just say no. As the player, even if I wanted to collide with these enemies, I'm not sure that I could, because sometimes they're just going to go flying away up there out of sight. And, I can't even interact with them if I wanted to. But we can see that sometimes, interesting dynamic situations do develop even with just this random enemy, depending on the shape of the level and the number of enemies and what they happen to be doing. You can have some interesting interactions here. You can also see that enemy at the bottom of the screen there that's completely outside of the play space, right? Like there's no way the player could ever interact with that enemy. You would have to fall down into that pit and die before you could even get to that enemy, right? So it's a little something. Let's go ahead and add some spikes down in that pit so that the player does actually die when they fall down there. A lot of game development these days is scrolling through menus, clicking on checkboxes, nudging things one pixel this way and one pixel that way, and dealing with small fiddly animation details that other people don't really notice. In this case, there's a nice little hack here where when the player dies, all we have to do is just reload the level. And so the way we do that in Unreal Engine is to just, call load level by name, and we just feed in the name of the current level, and that just causes the level to reload. This is not how you would handle respawning in like a full game, obviously, but this is for, prototype or like a game jam game or like a simple game like this. You can just do this and it gets you respawn working right away. I'm trying to stop the enemies from moving through the spikes now so that we can, kind of try to keep them from going down there. And with the right checkboxes clicked and the right drop down selected, we have achieved glorious victory, I guess. We really need to get it so that these enemies are damaging the player when we collide with them. That's going to be the next thing. The next thing is going to be player hit points. I can never remember whether it's a widget that creates the heads up display in Unreal Engine or what. It always takes me a while to remember to figure it out. I can never remember. Usually what I do is I just go and look at a previous project where I've already done this, and then I just reference that and do whatever I did last time. Eventually I figured it out. And there you go. Now when the enemy hits the player, you'll lose hit points. And we'll add a particle effect to emphasize when the player has taken some damage. So the question here, now that we've got all this put together, the question is, what does this do, right? Like, what do we think of this enemy who moves around randomly? How is this influencing the gameplay? Is this an interesting kind of enemy movement pattern, or what are we doing here? So what do we think of this random enemy movement? What do we think about this? So I think that one of the big takeaways we had is that it's unreliable, right? Like, we don't know if the enemy is even going to be playing the game, right? A lot of the times they just wander off into nowhere, right? Like, so far away from the player couldn't even access them, right? So not only are they not threatening the player, they're just not even available to the game, right? They're just like completely out of the game, going wandering off into nowhere. And we tried to reduce that, but we never eliminated it. And I feel like that's kind of an inherent quality of this random movement pattern, because the random movement has no relationship to the rules of the game or to the goal, the objective of the player, the thing that the player is trying to do. Instead, they're just moving randomly. And so a lot of the times, they're just not going to be relevant to what's going on, right? They're unreliable. They're not always relevant. And they just randomly leave the play area, right? So yeah. So there's that. And then we've got, what else? But sometimes it was interesting, right? Sometimes it's sometimes interesting behaviors came out of it. The main problem was that though it was sometimes interesting, it was not always interesting, right? It was just very unpredictable and unreliably interesting. And so, like, we saw sometimes it would actually come like zooming straight towards the player, right? And then this would happen randomly, and we didn't know if it was happening or when it was happening. It was kind of an after the fact thing because we never knew what to expect from the enemy, right? So that's kind of an interesting thing. It is unexpected, right? We never know what's going to happen. I don't know if that's a virtue, but that's definitely something that we were seeing. I'd say that's enough for now for this. We'll get back to. So what's next? Let's see. So we've got a random. We've got like a random. So this is technically called a random walk algorithm, is like the term computer science term for this. Like a wandering enemy, whatever you want to call it. What's next? Well, there's a classic style of movement that I think is very important in game design. I like to refer to this as a patrolling enemy, someone who moves back and forth between two places, or someone who moves in a fairly decided pattern. Whether in a 3D game, that might be more complex than just back and forth, but you see it a lot in platforming games as an enemy who walks back and forth. I think to some people, predictability can seem like a bad thing, but when an enemy's movement is predictable, it actually can create a lot of... it can create a very interesting play space for the player. It can create an environment for the player to play around in and experiment with stuff. A very unpredictable environment doesn't really do much for the player, right? I think this pattern of enemy movement has a lot of virtues. It's very, on the surface you might think, well, it's very predictable, it's very simplistic, but if you think about the effect that it has, if you think about like the hitboxes and the critical path, right? The effect that this has is very predictable, right? Like it's having a certain effect, and it's kind of just moving that, like if you think of that, if you think back to the N++ example and how the enemy was creating this area of threat, and it was sort of, and that area was kind of warping the critical path. You can think of this patrolling enemy as an enemy who is sort of just moving back and forth and warping the critical path in a way that's sort of reminiscent of something like a planet moving in its orbit around a star. It's sort of it's kind of moving around and creating this dynamic interaction with the player's critical path, and this kind of dynamism. It's really kind of nice, and it creates a lot of it kind of adds to the play space, right? Whereas the random enemy was often inconsistent and wasn't necessarily adding anything to the game. The patrolling enemy, though it is pretty simple, though it is pretty basic, it is adding something to the game, and it's adding a nice little like bit of sort of flavor to the game. All right, now we've got to set some stuff up so that we can compare and contrast these different enemies and see how they operate in different kinds of levels and stuff. So first, we're going to need to create a door so that we can load, jump from one level to the next. Alright, so with the door out of the way, now the camera is in the wrong spot, so we're going to need to push it over to the right. The issue is that the camera is centered on the player, and so, everything left of the player is basically dead space, right? It's behind the player. You really want to be looking forward, so we want to kind of move it over. So the way I found to do this is something called target offset on the spring arm component. So I moved it 500 centimeters over, and then I ran into this bug where the spring arm was apparently colliding with stuff in the level, and so it would actually shove the camera behind the level. And so the solution to that, the one that I came up with, was just to push it 500 centimeters back away from the level using the target offset. patrolling enemy was giving me some trouble for a while because he was refusing to stop and turn around at the edges of his patrol zone. It turned out that I had my wires crossed, so he was actually going in the wrong direction the whole time, so he never reached his destination because he was walking away from it. But finally I found the crossed wires, and then everything worked. Once I had the foot patrol enemy, it was very easy to create a flying patrol enemy. It's just a simple variation of the other one. Just copy-pasted stuff, added a flying speed. Now that we've gotten the game development stuff together, we just need to do some level editing. Just create some different levels for testing out the different enemies so we can compare and contrast them. So here I'm just setting up these pillars so that we can jump between the two areas, and then some enemies to cover them so that we have to kind of time our jumps depending on the enemy movement. You can see I'm also tweaking the enemy movement speed. Whenever you have a thing like this, like a number, I often find that it's useful to just like overshoot it in both directions. So first I start off with the enemy being way too fast and then way too slow. And then, gradually we can kind of close in on a connection, on a sensible number. At this point, it seems like that second enemy has too tight of a patrol around that pillar, so we don't really have a good jump here. We don't really have a good window of opportunity to jump over there. So we're going to modify the areas that they're patrolling, kind of move them around a little bit, tweak them, and see if we can get a little bit of a better outcome. So here you can see I'm modifying the kind of tweaking how far they go in their patrol range. So just having them go closer to the edges of their patrol area, and then also going to modify their move speed, have them move a little bit faster. Actually, having them move so slowly kind of makes them harder because it's harder to time the interactions with them because it takes so long for them to get out of the way. So you can see this first level is similar to the N++ level we were using, and this one has the random walk enemy. And of course the random walk enemy just doesn't play the game, so we just walk right by him. He has no impact on the player. And the patrolling enemy is more interesting. See, he's kind of, we've got this kind of back and forth going where we need to kind of navigate around him. And then the second patrolling enemy is even more interesting. I think part of why this one works better is that the enemy is actually larger, I think. So I wasn't very careful about the precise size of the enemies. So I think that's a big part of what happened there. But the same level, but now with some enemies, and suddenly it's a lot more interesting. There's a lot more interaction going on, and I had to die for the first time. So we're really seeing that, this is a really different experience from the other levels. And it's going to take some more analysis to kind of get where we're going with this, but we're going to add another enemy there, try to make it a little bit more, add a little bit more to this experience. And then I'm going to, I was seeing a problem because I was randomizing the enemy damage, so it was a random number between, I think, 0 and like 8, or no, 0 and 16 it was. And so now I'm going to average it so that it's the average of 3 random numbers from 0 to 16. So this will create like a nice bell curve, centered around like 8 or maybe 7, somewhere around there. I think that'll be a better amount of damage for me to do. And you can kind of see that it's kind of working there. Took like 4 damage that first time, so pretty close to 7 or 8, close enough maybe. And you can see this level is working a lot better. We're having to dodge around. It's taking a lot of like acrobatics to try to navigate this, and then I'm just kind of flubbing the jump is the other thing. Much times, and then so I think this. Oh yeah, and then I messed up on the vertical height of that. That it's actually you can't jump that high, so because it felt too low before, but then I messed up on trying to make it a little bit harder and made it impossible. Yeah, I don't know if the timing on those two, like they should probably offset more from each other. So what I wanted to do was to draw the critical path of these two levels, the one with no enemies in it and the one with the enemies in it. However, this didn't work. The two critical paths ended up looking identical, except for this one little, swirl here that represents dodging the first enemy to create some extra time. I think you can see pretty clearly, though, when you watch the video, you can see the dynamism that's added by this patrolling enemy, but it's not in the critical path. So I'm going to try another level, and this time we're going to go with a level we've actually seen twice already in this video, once in Super Meat Boy and once in Braid. And you can see how these two levels are basically the same. It's these long... So this level has basically 3 long, thin corridors stacked on top of each other where the player has to alternate from side to side. And then the levels, both levels have basically patrolling enemies in the middle of them. All right, so here we have this level set up in our little test bed here. And you can see that, it works pretty similarly to the other games. You just have to jump around the enemies to get to the end of the level. If you think about what this is doing, if you think about the level without the enemies in it, and you think about the level with the enemies present, what you end up with is, what you kind of end up seeing is that you're basically taking the shape of the level, and then you're adding these enemy movement patterns that complement that shape, right? They're accentuating the pre-existing shapes and movement patterns and the critical path, right? They're taking the critical path and they're adding to it. They're adding these little wrinkles to it, but they're adding the wrinkles in a way that sort of, it sort of creates like a discussion between the player and the level shape. So here's another example. So here we can see that, the critical path is pretty obvious. You would just hop across the platforms. But then these enemies are accentuating that, right? They're acting, to complement that critical path and add these extra details to it. You can see how they're adding this kind of dynamism where now you need to kind of time your jumps to match the pattern of the enemy movement. And I think this level serves as a really good comparison when we look at how the random moving enemy behaves on this level. Even an army of random moving enemies, they just don't affect the critical path, right? You're just going to walk straight through the level regardless of their presence. And so, I like to refer to this as being level agnostic, that these random moving enemies, that their movement pattern is level agnostic, that it doesn't relate to the level, that it certainly isn't complementing the level, right? It doesn't have anything to do with the level shape, and it's not affecting the critical path at all, right? It's basically not part of the game. It's not influencing the game at all. So finally, this gives us our third principle. This one is just, accentuate level shape. I'm not sure what the correct, if there's some kind of term for this, just this is what I've been calling it, accentuate or complement. I don't know, but suffice it to say, one of the things that enemy movement pattern should do is enemy movement should be complementary to the shape of the level, right? It should relate to the play space and to what's going on. So that's kind of what this one is saying, and hopefully it'll get a name someday. All right, so now we've got to go and find our next principle of enemy movement. First, we need to establish our third enemy movement pattern, and this is the chasing pattern. This is the pattern where the player is being aggressively, where the enemy is moving aggressively towards the player, trying to get to them, trying to attack them, that kind of stuff. Now that we have this chasing pattern, we can use this to construct the level. So you can see here that with this level, there's no amount of moving left and right that's going to get you past this enemy to reach that door on the other side of it. So you're going to have to move into this area on the left here and jump up, and then find some way to circle around the enemy to kind of slip by it, right? So this is actually the same level we were just looking at, the one with the, you can see how it's the same basic shape, but, there's this opening to the left where the player can kind of hide from the enemy to try to get some space, and then the door is in the same place. I just added more enemies and then kind of made spaces for the enemies to inhabit. But the basic shape of the level is the same. It's basically just a straight line. And that's really what I want to emphasize here about this level, is that it's really a very simple level shape. There's there's basically a corridor with a vertical shaft, and then there's like four or five platforms kind of littered about the area around the middle of it, and that's it. That's the whole level. There's not a whole lot going on here. There's 4 enemies, and all those enemies do is at each tick they just move towards the player. And these ones aren't even using pathfinding. They're just literally just moving straight at the player. So if there's a wall in the way, they'll just walk into it and stop. And yet, despite the fact that this is a really simple level, that there's very little going on in the level design, you can see that there's a lot of gameplay coming out of this, right? There's a lot of stuff going on. The player is kind of able to move back and forth, and there's a lot of situations where the player, if the player moves this way, then the enemies move to follow him, and that changes now what the player has to do in response. So the player it's all kind of based on the player's actions, but the there's this interaction going on where the player's choices early in the game are affecting where the enemies are going to be later in the game. And so there's this back and forth, and now the player has to run backwards and forth and kind of jump up and down and move around and try to dodge around the enemies and create these different opportunities. And it's way more dynamic than anything we've seen so far, right? This is a whole this is like a whole nother realm of game design, right? Like we've just like completely changed what's going on here just by adding this very simple enemy movement pattern. Because again, the way that this enemy moves is the same as the other flying enemies, right? It's no different. The only difference is now, instead of moving towards a arbitrary point that we defined in the level, like with the patrolling enemy, or towards a random direction, like with a random enemy, this enemy just takes the player's position and moves towards that, right? And again, if there's a wall in the way, he's just going to walk into the wall, and he's just going to keep walking into that wall. He's not going to walk around it. He's not going to walk through it. He's just going to be stuck. The thing I really want you to notice here is how dynamic this level is. It's very different from the other levels. For example, think about where the player is dying, right? Every time the player dies here, he's actually dying in a different spot. He's not really dying in the same way. Sometimes he dies from fall damage, from falling too far, falling too fast and hitting the ground. Sometimes he hits the enemies. He hits different enemies. He hits them coming from different directions. The player will be moving in different directions. The player will be, jumping or running or doing all kinds of different things. It's a lot more, there's just a lot more going on here. Even though the number of enemies, the size of the level, everything is basically within the same range of complexity as all the other levels that we dealt with. The only thing we've really changed is the enemy movement pattern is different, and the shape of the level is different, but it's not more complicated, it's just different. So here, what I was thinking was I was going to slow down this enemy by making him move through this labyrinth before he can start moving towards the player. But of course, I forgot that the enemy is not going to be pathfinding. So instead, the enemy just walks into the nearest wall and just stops there, and he never makes it out of this labyrinth. And so now you can see that this new labyrinth does actually work because the walls are angled, so the enemy will slide along them and get through. And again, the idea here is I'm trying to change the timing for these enemies so that each enemy, instead of all of them just coming in at the same time, I want to kind of offset them and have them come in, one enemy comes in and then a few minutes later the next enemy comes in, like a few seconds later the next enemy will come in, and then you kind of like that. You get sort of a different pattern, a different rhythm to the process of playing through the level, just to try to add more kind of dynamic elements, more stuff going on. Because before the player was really reacting to all of the enemies as one group, and I kind of want him to react to the enemies individually. I don't want all the enemies to be a mob that just kind of groups up and follows the player around. I didn't think that was very interesting, so I think separating them a little bit is going to produce some interesting results. So here we're actually about to see a flaw in the level design. You can see that the player makes it through the level really easily here. He completely avoids the third enemy. The enemy doesn't even have time to get to the level before the player has already won the game. So we have to rework around that. And so putting an enemy, originally back in the day, the enemy was between the player and the door, and the whole concept of the level was the player has to run from the enemy and dodge around and find a way to loop around the enemy to get back towards the door. So we're going to try to angle back towards that design. So that didn't really work as well as I'd like, so we're going to need to add some more stuff to this. I mean, it technically worked in the sense that the enemy is now between the player and the door at the beginning of the level, but they come out pretty fast, so I want to slow them down some more. and just kind of make this more of a process, right? Because I want to really have this interaction going on between the player and the enemy, where the player is really having to think about how the enemy is moving in response to their actions, right? I want the player to be have to consciously acknowledge this aspect of the gameplay, that there's this interdependence between them, right? That I want the player to actually be using this fact that the enemy moves based on their emotions so that they can win the game. They have to kind of show some, this is kind of like a puzzle, right? Like this is N++, this is kind of like a puzzle game. So the way the level is going to be laid out is that the player has to figure out the puzzle of this level. They have to figure out what's going on, and they have to then, execute this kind of platforming challenge. They have to move in the correct manner to kind of lure the enemy out of the way, and then they have to dodge past the enemy and kind of sneak in through the passageways to get to the exit and win the game. That's the idea of this level. So we haven't really gotten there yet. We're working on it. So so the idea here, you can see I made this little flat here where the enemy walks into it, and it's just a solid wall. So now I'm kind of using this pathfinding failure of the enemy as part of the design. So, you can see what happens here. Basically, the player has to come out of the thing and then go down in order for that enemy to move down. Because now, if the player comes out of the initial area and he jumps upward, the enemy blocking the door will just stay where he is. He'll just stay locked in that corner. So the player has to come out and then go down in order to let him out. And this is kind of helping us kind of shape the level a little bit more, right? So now the player is going to have to realize this fact, because you could go any direction in order to get past this initial area, but this is giving us more control, more influence over the shape of the critical path, right? We're kind of looking at what the player's doing, and we're trying to create interactions with it and dynamics. So you can see here how the player now has to find these ways of looping around and staying alive for a period of time in order to give the enemy time to come out from behind all these, to make his way through this labyrinth and get out here. And so this is much more like what I was intending for the level, right? This is actually starting to shape up into what it originally was, what I was kind of thinking of it, how I was thinking it would work. So here you can see an example where the player comes out of the initial area and then goes up, and you can see how the enemy in the bottom right stays locked in his labyrinth. He's not going to come out until the player goes down. So this one doesn't work, but even if the player had survived, he was doing the wrong thing anyway, right? So he wasn't going to win. And here we get an example of a well-executed loop where the player loops around a few times, drawing out the enemies, and, then tries to get past them. So what is all this? What is it that I'm trying to show you with this enemy, chasing me around thing? Well, this is, what I want you to see here is that there's this give and take relationship between the player and these enemies, right? There's this kind of like pushing and pulling going on where the enemies are moving around and the player is like luring the enemy this way and the enemy kind of goes a little bit that way, and then the player is like, oh wait, no, let's go back, let's lure the enemy back into this area because we want him over there. And the player is thinking about the positions of the different enemies, and he's like moving himself in order to lure them to different places. And then sometimes there's a little bit off and the enemies kind of come out of those areas, and now they're following him around and stuff. So this is it's creating a very dynamic situation where kind of things are going on that the player doesn't want. So hopefully you can see what I'm talking about here with the player's movement and the enemy movement, and how they have this kind of this thing going on where there's this, the player is luring the enemy this way, and then the enemy is kind of going this way or that way, and there's this accidental stuff going on, and there's this strong interaction going on between the player and the enemy, like give and take, this push and pull. It's kind of nebulous. It's kind of hard to define or describe or to like show you exactly what this is. But I think it's a really important principle. And the question is, like, what do we call this? So I've been calling this interplay. And if you look up the word interplay in the dictionary, it says that interplay is a two-way relationship, an interaction between two things, or like a two-way relationship, right? A reciprocal interaction between two things. And so it kind of makes sense for this, and it's often used in the context of games. So I think it makes sense. You need to be aware that this is a word that is used in a lot of other contexts, so it's not just for this specific principle, but it's it's kind of a nebulous thing. So you need something to talk about it. And so I think interplay is an okay word to use if you're trying to talk about this kind of thing. So our next principle will be no surprise to anyone. It is the critical path. So obviously we've been discussing the critical path this whole time, but now we need to kind of understand what it is. I was not able to find a good definition of this term online, but I'm pretty sure I've heard people using it. The way I think about this term is that I think of a game like Skyrim or Morrowind, where you have the main quest, right? The main, playthrough of the game, the main direction of the game, and then you have like side quests and these other kinds of stuff that you can go off and do that are not part of the main game. I think it's a little bit clearer in that case, right? In a kind of a broad sense, like, okay, well, if you're going on side quests, that's obviously not part of the critical path, because the critical path is kind of like the normal. Normal is the wrong word. It's kind of like the straight path from the beginning of the game to the end of the game, and it's kind of the obvious path, right? It's not taking like clever tricks or fast ways of getting through stuff. It's not speed running. It's not going off on side quests. It's not taking shortcuts. It's just kind of taking the obvious, like the naive approach to the game, and just kind of going straight for it, and just going from the beginning, and just keep going until you get to the end. One of the great virtues of the side-scrolling platformer is that it makes visualizing the critical path very simple, because the choice that the player is making in a platformer is, what direction do they move in? Are they jumping? Are they moving left or right? It's a very simple thing to visualize. You can just draw a line, and that basically tells you about the critical path. Obviously, in a game like Morrowind, it would be much more complicated to visualize the critical path, right? It would be more like you'd have to write it as like text or something, like a story, or combine a story with like a flow chart with like a map of the game world. It'd be very complicated. So here you can see, like, with a simple flat level where you've just got the player character and a flat level, and then the door, and all you have to do is walk across the level to get to the door, and then you win. The critical path is obvious, right? It's just a straight line across the level. And if you have a level where there's a chasm between the player and the end of the level, then the player has to jump across that, right? And so now, instead of a straight line, it's kind of like a curve, right? Where it's like a it's a curve representing the jump, the jump arc. However, if we try to take this idea of drawing a line to our N++ level, I don't really think that the idea of drawing a line for the critical path, it would really be that helpful on this level, because this level has a lot of dynamic elements where, depending on the player's actions, they will create a different circumstance that they will then have to react to and play through. So the critical path doesn't really make sense as a line in this situation. Instead, I think a good way to visualize it would actually be to bring in some playtesters and have them play through the game and record them playing through the game, and then think of that video of them playing through the game of that gameplay. Think of that video as the critical path, right? So instead of drawing a line, just have actual gameplay that you can see that would show how they would move through the game. And maybe if you're going to visualize it in your mind, maybe you should just visualize that video, right? Even if you don't have playtesters yet, maybe thinking of the critical path as one of your players playing through the game. Maybe that would be a better way to kind of visualize the idea of a critical path rather than a line. But it really depends, right? So in some cases, like I think in the case of Super Mario Brothers, a critical path, drawing a line on the level might kind of make sense as a way to quickly visualize the path. And even on this level here, where we've got all this dynamic stuff going on, I think the line does work for the first part of the game because the player has to go left and then up and then kind of loop around the enemy, and also for the end of the level where the player has to, they have to move straight into the exit, right? So for certain parts of this level, it works, and so it just kind of depends on what you're doing and what's helpful to you. The player's critical path is very important when thinking about enemy movement. If you look at those levels that I created over the course of this video, the way that I created each of them was that I looked at the player's critical path through the level, and then I added an enemy somewhere on that critical path, and then I gave them a movement pattern that interacted with the player's critical path in some way, right? So when you're thinking about enemy movement, when you're thinking about enemy placement, you're really thinking about them in terms of how they relate to the critical path. Because if you just add a bunch of interesting enemies moving in interesting ways to the level, but it's not on the player's critical path, the player might just walk by them, right? If they're not actually, in a traditional platformer, in a traditional side-scrolling platformer at least, if you think of something like Super Mario Brothers or something, and you have like interesting stuff going on like in the background or below the level or above the level, the player's just going to run straight by that stuff. He's not going to interact with it. He's not going to go out of his way to get into trouble, right? Like that's not how these kinds of games work. I don't want to talk too broadly here because there are other kinds of games out there. So one example that comes to mind is Gloomhaven. In Gloomhaven, the goal of most of the scenarios isn't to just run by all the enemies and get to the end of the level. The goal of most scenarios in Gloomhaven is to defeat each of the enemies, right? So in that situation, I'm not sure how the critical path would work exactly, or how enemy movement patterns would relate to the critical path, or how you would think about that, because that's a very different kind of situation. Because the player's critical path, I guess it would go to each of the enemies, right? Wherever you place an enemy, the critical path is going to have to go to that place because now that's the objective, is to get to that enemy and defeat them. So, that might change things around. I'm not sure how that would work. So I am kind of talking about side-scrolling platformers here mainly. All right, so as we approach the second hour of this video, let's move on to our next principle. The next principle is enemy movement patterns. Nope, wait, that's wrong. Multiple enemy movement patterns. So this is when an enemy has more than one enemy movement pattern. Some enemies, like those found in platformer games, might have only a single way of moving. They constantly patrol, However, most enemies in games have multiple movement patterns that they use in different situations. A common one is the default stealth game enemy who patrols or idles until he sees the player, then he switches to a chasing movement pattern. For example, you can see that this enemy here is a patrolling enemy, but then when he sees us, he alerts and switches into a kind of turtling mode. This example comes from a game called Goner, and if you've made it this far into a video about enemy movement patterns and how to design them, you would probably, I feel pretty safe in recommending this game to you, and you should probably go get that. Alright, so let's go play some Megaman X and see what we can find. So this first enemy, this little bunny here, what's he up to? Like, what's he doing? We can see, he's hopping around and he's shooting at us, but he's kind of hopping away from us. That's kind of strange. Why is he doing that? And okay, so here's this. Okay, so now there's two enemies. There's one who, let's call him a lumberjack guy. He's chucking platforms around the level. That's a little strange. And then there was another one. There was like a flying enemy there. And so, okay, so these rabbits seem to be chasing Mega Man. So the other one was kind of hopping around. It seemed kind of random, but the other ones were kind of chasing you. So what's going on with these things? So let's see. We can see that it has multiple movement modes because it is hopping. It's alternating between hopping, standing still, and firing its weapon. Okay, so... Alright, so that flying enemy is like dropping bombs on us. Alright, let's look at this lumberjack guy. So he's got basically a couple of things he's doing. He's chucking platforms at us, he's standing still, and what else does he do? He laughs at us. Oh, well, that's fun. What else is going on here? All right. Let's see. So let's look for those flying enemies. What are they doing? So they're dropping bombs, and then the bombs are timed explosives. That's really interesting because that means you could potentially walk right through a field of these bombs without taking any damage as long as you time your movement right? Because you could even stand right on top of one of these bombs and not be in any danger as long as your timing was right. Because they only explode at the end of their timing. All right, so what's going on with this level overall? Let's think about this. Hey, you can stand on these platforms while he's chucking them. That's kind of interesting. Oh yeah, and it knocks you off, so you don't even go that far away. That's interesting. It's interesting how there's this interaction going on here, right? Because the part of what makes this platform work well as an overall design in that spot is that the other enemy is there, the flying enemy, to knock you off of it so that you're not going flying across the level unless you sort of deliberately make yourself do so, right? So there's something really interesting about this level because the different enemies are actually they're actually complementing each other, right? They're not only do they have multiple movement modes and multiple actions that they take at different times, different sequences of patterns, but those sequences of patterns and the enemy's positions in the levels and their different abilities are all they're all carefully choreographed together, right? They're doing this kind of choreographed dance that they're doing together, so they construct this overall experience of the level. So there are 3 enemies in this scene. The bunnies are presented first. Normally you can jump over the bunnies, but when they're hopping, you can't jump over them. And they don't go high enough for you to go under them either. So their hops stop your forward momentum. You just have to stop when they're hopping. All you can do is just wait. So effectively, what this hopping movement is doing is it's increasing how much space the bunnies threaten. In other words, the effect of their hop is the same as if the bunnies were simply growing taller and walking towards you and then shrinking back down to normal height when they stop moving. So they're like rhythmically growing larger and advancing towards you. They're rhythmically, they're threatening a larger space as they advance towards you. And then they shrink back down. The bunnies threaten the ground, and you can jump over them if you get the timing right, but then you encounter the lumberjacks. There are 2 lumberjacks in the scene, and you approach both of them from below. The bunnies threaten this area near the ground, while the lumberjacks threaten the area just above that. If you jump over the bunnies, you'll be jumping into the lumberjacks' line of fire. And if you try to jump over the lumberjack, then you'll collide with the wasps. If you stay on the ground and take out the bunnies first, that's easy, but now the wasps are dropping bombs on you, and you can't fight them without ascending up past the lumberjack zone to reach them. So you stay on the ground and take out the bunnies first. That's easy, but now the wasps are dropping bombs on you, and you can't fight them without ascending up past the lumberjack zone to reach them. Okay, I'm running short on time here, so just pretend I had some sort of really good conclusion to this part of the video. Really all I wanted to say was that this part of this level has good level design and good encounter design. The enemies are all layered, and all the elements here have a harmonious relationship. I also wanted to try to show you how you can just pop into any level. You can just pop into any level in any game and just start critically analyzing the stuff you encounter there. I actually think that running D&D games is a good way to practice building encounters and combining different sorts of enemies. In the D&D regions of YouTube, Matthew Colville recently did a video where he said, playing lots of different games makes you a better designer. I really think that a game designer is just somebody who's played a lot of games and thinks about them critically, someone who develops a language for thinking about game design. I agree with this point that, you need to... It's hard to study game design. There aren't... I can't point you to, a book. So my kind of reference for this problem in game design is that in animation, there's a book called The Animator's Survival Kit. And that book just lays out, a ton of principles of animation and just endless examples of each principle. And it really helps you to understand how to learn about animation, right? It really goes over the fundamentals of animation. And if you go through that book and practice all of the principles it lays out, and you get good at those principles, you'll be a good animator. It's just it's a one-stop thing to just learn basic animation stuff. There is no equivalent book in game design. There is no resource that accomplishes anything even remotely resembling what that book does for animation. In game design, we just don't have that kind of resource. I don't know exactly why this is, but for some reason there isn't a lot of substantive long-form content out there about game design. I think part of this is just that developing a video game, designing an entire video game takes a lot longer than animating something does. And so I think, part of it is just the number of games that a designer makes in their entire lifetime. It's kind of like in classical orchestral music, there's this idea that like after someone makes 9 symphonies that they'll die of old age, and the idea being basically that, I guess this is historically, most of the famous classical composers only made like 9 symphonies, and it's just hard to, it takes so long to make a symphony, to write a whole symphony, that you just can't really make that many in one human lifetime. And there's a similar thing in video games. Like, you just can't make very many games. Like, one person just can't make very many. And so it's really hard to actually have... So like the Animator Survival Kit, part of the reason why it's so exhaustive is that the guy who wrote it was teaching animation, and he was a Disney animator. And he just had decades of experience to draw upon, and countless examples from all kinds of different projects and all kinds of different situations, animating different kinds of characters and within different kinds of stories and stuff. And so there was just like, he had a lot of experience to draw upon, a lot of knowledge that he had to draw upon. And I guess it's hard to have that equivalent background in game design. So maybe that's part of the problem. But another thing is, there are a lot of really good game designers on the planet, and most of them just aren't really putting out content where they explain game design. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. Is I'm just trying to, I'm not someone who knows very much about game design, but I'm just trying to provide what I can, just some kind of like baseline, just some place to start, right? If you're trying to design a video game, one of the really important things is the movement patterns of the enemies. And if you go look around at like GDC talks and stuff, I don't know of anyone else who's ever discussed this topic before. It's, and that kind of just goes to show you, if you search on YouTube for other videos about this topic of, okay, well, you're designing a video game, like an action game. One of the really big questions is that the enemies have to move around in some kind of pattern, and the relationship between the enemy movement patterns and the player's movement pattern, they're super important. And there's loads of videos about like game feel and the player's movement, but I don't know of anyone who's ever discussed enemy movement. And it's just a complete hole. There's just a chasm there, right? And it's just like really, I don't know what's going on with this, but it's a strange thing. And then, so anyway. All right, so we're running short on time. Let's just recap the principles, and then we can just kind of wrap up. So first we've got Headspace, right? So we need to give the player time to think and come up with plans. Then we've got to threaten the player. And then we need to accentuate the shape of the level, right? We need to complement the level itself. And then we've got Interplay, dynamic push and pull interactions going on. Then we've got the critical path, which is kind of how we know where to put enemies and what to do. Then we have multiple movement patterns, which is where enemies move between different patterns. And then we have multiple enemies in an encounter and how to compose that encounter to make an interesting and like synergistic relationship. So I hope I've given you a decent head start on the question of how to design enemy movement. But that's not nearly all that we need to talk about, because there's a lot more to designing enemy movement than just how to do it, right? There's a lot more than just laying out all of the ideas on a page or, putting together all these techniques. There's a lot of other kinds of questions other than how that you need to ask. And so I think maybe what we should be asking ourselves is, why do enemies move at all? There's a talk by the game designer Jonathan Blow where he talks about this why question, and he uses the example of this level from 1001 Spikes. The level begins with a hectic escape from collapsing floors and deadly spikes, and just when the player has escaped and breathes a sweet sigh of relief, they die to an unseen spike trap. So why is the game like this? Why does it include this spike trap? Why is this spike trap a surprise? What is the idea here? I think that this spike trap is a joke. It is the punchline of a joke. This is a video from Extra Credits where they talk about the idea of the fantasy of a game and how the whole design of the entire game and all the levels and animation and everything in it should really be oriented towards whatever the fantasy of this particular game is. This is a common term. I've heard a lot of different people use this kind of terminology and talk about games this way, so this is a good concept to learn. In that video, they define fantasy as the feeling that you're living out the theme of a game. More than just including swords and dragons in a game, you have to ensure that the player feels like a legendary hero living out a grand epic. To achieve this, you have to understand the fantasy you're trying to convey, you have to work with the art team, and you have to create mechanics that are congruent with the fantasy. So, what is the fantasy of 1001 Spikes? This is the official webpage for 1001 Spikes from the developer, and you'll notice that the first headline here reads, "Pick yourself up and try again. You can avoid the traps and find the treasure, even if you die 1,000 deaths." So this lays out explicitly that dying to a trap like this is in fact the fantasy of the game. This still leaves the question, why is it a joke? Steve Lee is a level designer who worked on Dishonored 2 and BioShock Infinite, and he has a YouTube channel where he talks about the principles of level design. In this video, he lists 15 questions to ask yourself when doing level design. The first 4 questions are, why is this interesting? Is it clear to the players why this is interesting? What is this game really about? What kind of spaces work best for this game? I think these questions will help us get at our why question, so let's give them a try. So, why is this interesting? I don't want to dig too deeply into the idea of humor and comedy, but I'll just say that in general, 1001 Spikes, even the general fantasy of this game, is a really frustrating experience, and humor helps to cut through emotionally trying experiences like that. There's another aspect of this question, which is the sort of mechanical, skill-based perspective. Why is this part of the level so hard in the first place? Why is this section of the level so hard to begin with? The answer to that goes back to the fantasy of the game and the overall experience that this game is going for. So, this first question answers our original conundrum. The surprise spike is better as a punchline because it is more interesting that way, in addition to checking off the other questions. Except that second one. It would take playtesting to see how many players actually get this joke when they play the game. Well, hey, now that we've got this nice checklist, let's go apply it to one of our other levels. So this was the level that we used when we were talking about Interplay earlier. I think it's pretty interesting that you have to fall back and slip past this first enemy, then go lure this guy out and loop around a few times to get him out of your way. And, you know, all this planning and dynamism, I think this is pretty interesting stuff. So I'd say that first question, you know, we could check that one off. But the second one, is it interesting to the player? Well, I can't say definitively without playtesting, but I'd hazard a guess at no. This level is too gimmicky. It's probably too hard for a less serious player, right? Like it's pretty tough to do all this circling around and even just figuring all this stuff out. It's kind of a tough level. But then on the other hand, I don't really feel like it's that well suited to an expert player either. We'll get back to that and I'll talk more about why later. Let's go to the third question. So we're going to have to come back to that second question, but the third question is about whether the level fits the fantasy of the game, and what is the fantasy of N++? We haven't talked about that. So there's a GDC talk from the developers of N++ where they talk about how they design levels for the game. And I would like to watch that video and summarize some points for you, but my internet just went down. So you'll have to go watch it on my behalf. I vaguely remember that she mentioned things like moving around acrobatically and slipping by enemies. So this level seems to check off that box because we're trying to sneak past these enemies and we're having to dodge them a lot and jump around. So I think we check off that third box of the fantasy of the game. All right, so fourth question. What kind of spaces work best for this game? Hey, look, my internet's back up now, so I can watch that video. Okay, so the talk is by Mara Shepard and Reagan Burns. Those are the developers of N++. So around 10 minutes into the video, she says that movement in N++ is a performance that needs to be learned and mastered. And that is the foundation of level design in this game. So our goal as designers is to have a deep understanding of how to control the ninja, to teach that control to players, and then to provide a variety of different contexts and motivations so that players can apply what they've learned and test and expand the boundaries of their skills. So, what kind of spaces work best in N++? Well, it's going to be spaces that answer to that foundation of the game's level design. Level spaces that require the performance of the skill of moving the ninja around and, understanding those verbs and how to use them, and having these different, it talks about a variety of contexts and having different motivations, different situations to apply what they've learned, being able to expand the boundaries of their skill. I feel like this kind of space that we're looking at here, I feel like it does answer those kinds of ideas, that kind of design foundation, because I do feel like this having to loop around, first of all, having to backtrack at the beginning of the level to get around the first enemy, and then having to loop around and stuff. I feel like this is a pretty decent space for this kind of game in general. All right, well, I'm out of time to edit this video, so it's going to have to just, I'm going to have to publish it as is pretty much. And yeah, so, like, comment, and subscribe. And I guess I'll see you in another 5 years when I make my next video.